So thank you all for being here, and I appreciate having this opportunity to discuss Latino masculinity as it specifically relates to sexual health research. I think this is such a critical topic given the number of studies that we're starting to see that look in this area, but we haven't moved forward as quickly in terms of looking at the ways in which we've sort of recreating a lot of stereotypes and presenting information that might not accurately reflect some of the subgroups or various populations in which we're studying. So I think the best point to start off at is by looking at the concept of sexual scripts. And when we think about sexual scripts, they're really sort of gender role and gender norm expectations that are tied to the ways in which males and females are supposed to behave in sexual or sexualized situations. And so this picture here sort of frames out the language around this scripting that occurs between men and women generally. And you could see that they're very different for males and females. And at the most basic level, if you look at the terms for males, being sexualized is actually very positive. The terms that are being used, none of them are really problematic in terms of having social consequences. On the flip side, sexual scripts for women, meaning that women who present themselves as sexualized or assertive, are really negative. And if you aren't sexualized, that's viewed as more positive. So you see that there are sexual scripts that exist in terms of roles and expectations, but the ways in which you enact this script really shape the ways people look at you and the related social consequences. So beyond gender shaping the ways in which we look at sexual scripts, there's also other factors, namely cultural factors. So when you think of your own culture, you could probably identify the ways in which it shapes who you are as a sexual being. And that's because we develop our own sense of sexual identity and desire within the context of our particular time in history, our social class, our ethnic or religious grouping, and of course the gender roles that are shaped within these various contexts. So for example, most of you grew up during a period where you would be scared of getting HIV if you engage in unsafe sexual practices. But if you speak to your parents, probably the greater fear was pregnancy, because contextually and at that time in history, there were different meanings around what was sexual risk. And even having sex before marriage was very different. So when we're looking at contextual issues, it's important to think about the ways in which they create our frameworks about beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors regarding sexuality. So really the way you want to think about sexual scripts are thinking of them as types of schemas that we use to organize our ideas about appropriate sexual experiences. And these create our personal norms regarding sexual behavior and how we choose to express these sexual behaviors and maintain these images and scripts. So for example, again, you might have been taught that girls shouldn't initiate sex. So if you're a woman, you're going to avoid trying to initiate sex because you don't want to face the stigma of the images that are framed here and the terms that are used to describe women here, even if you want to initiate or desire having sex. Similarly, men are socialized to believe that they're supposed to or are obligated to initiate sex even if they don't want to. Again, going back to the cultural framework, there's been a lot of work that's been done in terms of cohort and social class and religion, and even around sexual orientation with gay and lesbian populations. And also, most of the work is focused on heterosexual white young adults. However, less is known about other subgroups related to race and ethnicity. And this is really problematic because culturally influenced beliefs about expectations, behaviors tied to sexuality are really different according to ethnic group frameworks and norms and stereotypes about them, which we see in the research. So today we're really going to be looking at the concept of masculinity and how it, of course, affects Hispanic Latino men. And to take a step back, when we think about the concept of masculinity, we think about it in terms of strength and assertiveness and power and all of these sort of frameworks that sort of connotate individualism, toughness, and competition in a really positive way. Now, when we think about these terms, they usually have very positive connotations when we think about it in terms of athletes or entertainers or celebrities. And this is really also something that we will expect from our political leaders or other people who are in leadership positions, particularly men, but also when you're operating in a highly masculine environment like in the military or in athletic context. These are viewed as valuable traits that are very masculine. There's a current climate, though, that sort of frames it separately, which is toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity, which is really viewed as separate from masculinity. And it's important to think about that culturally because it shows that when we're talking about masculinity, there's one framework, but we want to frame it negatively, we use this other term of toxic masculinity. And this is really because when we're talking about masculinity, we're framing it as a general term, but specifically when we think about it, we frame it in terms of white male masculinity. And the thing to consider about this is when we add the layers of race or ethnicity, it shifts the way we look at masculinity. So for example, if we have these same characteristics and we apply them to Latino men, they tend to have negative connotations, and we use the term machismo. So if we're looking at the research, particularly on sexual health, machismo is used broadly to sort of frame all Latino male masculinity in a way that we don't look at it for other groups, particularly white males. And this is really important to think about then the ways in which culture adds a layer to our understandings of sexual scripting, which also then shapes the ways in which we frame research and approach our research that's informing the ways people think about groups and their sexual identity. So a really simple popular culture way of showing this is if you go to Google, which is of course the narrative of what's happening in popular terms because of the way it works with algorithms, etc. And one of the things you could type in is masculinity. And you'll see various images that pop up that show strength, that shows men with intimate relationships, shows men with each other in terms of power and competition. But the other thing I ask you to do is to type in the term machismo. And when we type in the term machismo, what pops up very prevalent in all of these images is a picture of a man and a woman, and particularly men presenting behaviors that are violent or abusive or domineering over women. And you're not seeing that in the same way when you type in masculinity. So this sort of gives a visual narrative to the points that I'm talking about in terms of the ways in which adding this cultural layer terminology brings us to a very different framework of masculinity when you're talking about machismo, which is typically applied to looking at Latino males across all forms of research. So let's take a step back and think about this term machismo and where it even came from. So from a linguistic standpoint, it's a derivative of the word mules or macho. And so it sort of came from the understanding that mules are stubborn and foolish. And it entered the English language usage in the 1920s, primarily as a way to describe exaggerated masculinity, and particularly, again, as it relates to men from Latin America. So it's used as a concept that sort of frames Latin American males, Latinos here, as being very machismo and being controlling, particularly of the ways in which they operate in la casa, the home, or the calle, the street, that they're very crossing over both contexts. They're very controlling, aggressive, dominated. And tied to that and central to this understanding of machismo is this highly aggressive sexualized behavior, particularly as it relates to the concept of controlling women. Now, if we look at it from a Spanish Latin American framework, it actually comes from the concept of military and patriarchal values. And it does have the separation of male and female in that males are supposed to be protective outside the home while women are protective and caretakers of the home, which is basically the ways in which most societies were set up historically. So again, machismo from a Latin American framework originally meant that men prioritize nurturing of their family, working hard, being brave, proud, and emotionally connected to their family members, including their spouse, in terms of the ways they're protective and taking care of their role, both outside the home as being protective and supporting their spouse partner inside the home. So central to this is these characteristics that are tied to Latin American masculinity, which is this valuing of the welfare and honoring of their loved ones. And this is again through the provision and protecting and defending their families and less fortunate members of society. So yes, there is a level of benevolent sexism within this, but it's too simplistic the ways in terms of how Westernized frameworks have framed it. And it sort of overshadows a lot of the positive frameworks of masculinity that are socialized across Latin American cultures towards men and their roles within the family or outside the family as well. So thinking back to the earlier point I was talking about in terms of scripting, this shows that the idea of culture really is influential in shaping our ideas about what are appropriate sexual scripts, not only by gender, but also by race and ethnicity. So when we're thinking about it in terms of Latino males, we can also then expect that the generation in which they're born, the religion, the nation of origin, and all these other type of cultural characteristics will shape the ways in which Latino masculinity is socialized and expressed. This means that we have to move away from this one framework of looking at Latino masculinity as being machismo and recognize that there's significant within group diversity within Latino culture, which means there's great diversity in terms of how we should look at Latino masculinity. As such, it's important that we start using the concept of callaberismo, which is complementary to the framework of machismo. So the less often talked about aspect of Latino masculinity is callaberismo. And this is sort of complementary to machismo in that it builds into other aspects that characterize values and socialization processes around Latino male sexuality and masculinity that are often not discussed in the traditional psychological literature examining this phenomenon. So what were we talking about here? Well, it's specifically looking at concepts of honor, dignity, and respect. That's not just in terms of how Latino men are socialized to interact with their partners, but also in terms of their value systems and interactions with their broader family. And you could see that this is really part of the traditional or the historical frameworks of machismo that really didn't get translated into Westernized culture frameworks. So it integrates certain values such as giving pride to the family, having respect for yourself, your interpersonal interactions with others, having pride in your culture as being a Latino, and also things like dignity and respect of self, which is also a reflection of how you interact with others, including your intimate partner or the women in your lives. So again, it's important to look at the key characteristics of callaberismo when we're thinking about this extending the framework of how we look at Latino masculinity, and recognize that those characteristics that I spoke about earlier, which include valuing the family, valuing interpersonal relationships, and valuing respect, those are all interconnected with one another. And they're also reflective of the collectivist traditions that are found in Latin American families, cultures, and communities. So it really shifts away from the ways in which machismo is framed from a really sort of individualistic standpoint to being more accurately reflecting the value of the community and others, which the research that looks at family and looks at community structures tends to frame around Latin American families as being collective and focusing more on the good for everyone within that unit. So of course, when we look at it this way, callaberismo makes more sense and is more applicable and must be included when we think about frameworks of Latino masculinity. So all of this discussion around Latino masculinity, and particularly expanding our perceptions of Latino masculinity beyond machismo to embrace also the concept of callaberismo, how is that really relevant to our understandings of Hispanic college men's sexual health? Well, there's a couple of ways in which we can answer that. First, there is a lot of research on Hispanic men's sexual health, but most of it tends to focus on community-based samples. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, when we don't consider the role of college and college context, we really miss a lot of important influential factors. So for example, most students that attend college have access to sexual health services and even sexual health educational resources that people in the community might not have as readily access to. Also, in college contexts, college students may have differing populations in which they interact with and differing potential partners with whom they're engaging in intimate relationships. Finally, students that are operating in college health contexts might have differing goals and thus give differing values to sexual risk-taking behaviors or have differing decision-making processes that influence how they approach their sexual health. This is really critical to think about also because the number of college men attending colleges today, the number of Hispanic men, attending college today, has more than tripled over the past 3 decades. And college Hispanic males are one of the fastest growing groups on campuses today. And Hispanic students are actually the fastest racial ethnic minority growing on college campuses today as well. So this means that we have to start looking at their needs very differently, as most research on college students tends to focus on white middle class populations. So the lack of culturally specific knowledge about college Hispanic men's sexual health is really an important area for us to look at, and tied to that, of course, are these ideas about masculinity. So one way to understand the importance of the contributions of callaberismo, or even a broader lens of Latino masculinity, is to look at it across different domains of sexual health research. And to do that, I'm going to look at 4 different areas: sexually transmitted infection knowledge, dating and hooking up behaviors, sexual initiation, and sexual victimization. So I'm going to start off by looking at sexually transmitted infections and the research that's been done around Hispanic college males on this topic. So as I said earlier, most of the current research on STIs is really focused on community samples and not college students. And that's because a lot of the research has a difficult time, of course, first of all, finding large numbers of Hispanic college male populations in one concentrated area to do this type of work. But also there's an assumption that college students are very similar in their behaviors. And we know this is not accurate because the research that's out there shows that there's very different types of outcomes around sexual health according to race and ethnic identity. Now, there has been some research that has shown that there is a relationship between attitudes towards STIs and broad across the board, including HIV, and knowledge among Hispanic adult males, but less has been done specifically in college populations. So we want to start looking at that specifically. So the one study I'm really interested in is one that was done by Dr. Eric Fenkel at Florida International here in Miami. And they did a study about attitudes towards sexual risk-taking and sexually transmitted infections among a predominantly Hispanic college population. Again, this university is 70% Hispanic, and it's residing in a city that is also 80% Hispanic. So there's this real sort of strong influence of Latin American values that surround the students that live here in the city and also attend the school. And the studies found that majority of the men reported having exclusive partners or being in monogamous relationships. Less actually had multiple partners at one time, which sort of challenges that idea of machismo that we tend to look at. However, a third reported having unprotected vaginal sex. But the reality is that fits with most of the research looking at college student sexual risk-taking. That's not unique to Hispanic males, or is not necessarily reflective of heightened machismo values around engaging in risk-taking behaviors. Where there is some unique and important things to look at in terms of the results is that the attitudes towards risk or understandings of risk is very different. So for example, over half of the sample disagree with the statement that using condoms lowers their risk for HIV, and few are over half are not discussing their own status or their partner's HIV status. And this is critical because that's what's really going to be a key part of protection, being able to know your own status and discuss it, and also knowing what your partner's. That might also reflect why the majority of the sample have never been tested for HIV. And part of that is because they're frightened by that. That's 80%. And that ties to the fears of knowing what the outcome would be. However, the research has been, that this study found, was that the results do not differ significantly in terms of risk behaviors between Hispanic college males and findings that are found in other college, predominantly white middle class samples. So what this does show is that the more acculturated Hispanic males are, and the younger they are, the more likely they are to engage in risk-taking behaviors, which fits with the broader research around becoming more Americanized and the values tied to that. So this is important for thinking about these ideas of traditional machismo and using them in a blanket way across all Hispanic college male population in terms of sexual risk-taking, and in this case specifically risk for STI acquisition. The next study I want to look at is around the concept of dating and hooking up, which a lot of people are probably familiar with, which could include things like Netflix and chill, or more often is defined as when women and men spend time together in a sort of loose, non-defined, unlabeled relationship, but it could be sexual or very intimate, but there's not a specific explicit label or understanding of a monogamous relationship, but it's very much a consensual agreement around this. Now, a lot of the popular culture narratives have framed this idea of hooking up or friends with benefits as being very normalized in college culture. And toward that end, there was actually a study again that was done here at Florida International University and also with some other universities across the United States that are considered predominantly white institutions, where meaning the majority of the population on that campus are white college students, while here at Florida International University, this is a Hispanic serving institution. And they did a study looking at this idea of hooking up cross-culturally. And what they looked at is sexual scripts around initial sexual romantic cultures that compared white and Hispanic students. And they found that there were three types of encounters that typically happen. The dating, the traditional dating where boy and girl go out together. It's not sexual, and you sort of have a long-term courtship where it's the two of you trying to feel each other out. Hanging out where it's not really sexual. You could do this in a group, but it's getting to know each other without the understanding that it might lead to a relationship and more trying to feel out a friendship or if there is any interest. And then hooking up, which is very much a mutual consensual, quicker, short-term sexual interaction that doesn't necessarily lead to or is not expected to be within the confines of a monogamous or long-term relationship. And this was a study done by Dr. Asia Eaton and colleagues at Florida International University and some other universities across the United States. So when you look at the results by race and ethnicity, you could see that there's some really distinct differences between the two groups. So you find overall Hispanic students are more likely to date, then hang out, and they're least likely to hook up. While if you look at the white students, dating is almost 50%, but hanging out and hooking up is more equally distributed across both groups. So you find that sexual behaviors overall, when you're looking at in terms of college students, they really haven't differed over time. So this idea that students are increasingly hooking up more often actually is not true. But you do find that for when you look at it by race or ethnicity, Hispanic college students tend to be engaging in more traditional dating behaviors rather than hooking up. And again, this challenges the idea of machismo, such that males are having quick sex and dominating and trying to control and using sexual aggression in these contexts. Now, this is where it's important to read literature carefully on your own and not just take sweeping understandings. Now, I did say earlier that whites are engaging or more likely to hook up in relationships, but if you look at the research as it came out, they're not having more hookup partners than Hispanics, but they're more likely to be in relationships, again, not monogamous, etc., that are hookups. So they're repeatedly having hookups with the same person. So you're finding that it's more likely that they are having not monogamous relationships, but they are repeatedly hooking up with the same person over and over. But still, dating is still more prevalent for Hispanic students. And Hispanic students are less likely to view themselves wanting to have hookup relationships as well. So that you find that the Hispanic students are more likely to engage in structured hanging out where there's a planning and there's more traditional gender roles in terms of who's getting together and doing it in group settings. But across all groups, there are some specific gender similarities where men are still viewed as more likely to be the initiators of the dating relationship. And women did not view that they are supposed to be initiating it either. However, women did not want men to be dominating the situation across all groups of women either. So you can also find that even though the dating trends have remained the same over the past decades, there are differences in terms of who is controlling, initiating, and who believes who should be doing this that need to also be explored further in the research and explored even by race and ethnic group identity. So I'm going to shift a little bit now and look at Hispanic college males' perceptions of sexual initiation. And when we're talking about sexual initiation, we're specifically considering here the ways in which people initiate sexual encounters, such as what strategies they use, how they let their partner know that they want to have sex, how do they signal their interest in sex. And this is really important to think about because this is really tied to understandings of consent. Now, sexual initiation is a really important topic in college settings because you can see across campuses right now there's this real push around sexual assault and concerns around different types, including rape and coercion, etc. And at the center of that is the concept of giving consent. And so a lot of universities have been struggling with implementing real clear policies about requiring each partner to give clear consent prior to any sexual activity. And there's a lot of debate and discussion around what's happening here. And the reason why it's important to look at it in college is because most students who don't have sexual intercourse in high school are going to have it during college. In fact, by their senior year, almost 90% of all college students have engaged in sexual intercourse. What the real issue around this in terms of sexual assault is people's ability to signal consent and also understand what are appropriate strategies to indicate their desire to have sexual intimacy with another partner. And so one of the things that we decided to do in our study was look at the ways in which college males and females signal their desire to have sex or what they view as appropriate sexual initiation strategies. And given that we're specifically talking about Latino masculinity today, I'm only going to present the data from the Hispanic college males. So we interviewed college males about their beliefs about appropriate sexual initiation strategies, and I'm going to present the findings for that here. So the first theme we found was the idea of when is it appropriate to initiate sexual intercourse. And overwhelmingly, the first most common thing that emerged was it was really sort of dependent on the relationship status or how they felt about the relationship or the person in the relationship. So usually it was the idea that both people felt comfortable with each other and they were willing to do this together. And for example, he said, when we both know we want to do it, I might not be like we're fully there, but it's not just sex either. But we've started connection and we want to do it and there won't be any drama. So it's this idea that both people want to do it, they're both willing to, and they're on their way to being in some sort of close, intimate relationship. The next falling under this idea of the relationship status or how the relationship is framing out is that it would also be a time when they want to sort of signal that they're willing to make a greater commitment or they're more invested in the relationship. So as one male said, you know, it's going to be something, so it's like part of doing something special between the two of you. It is time to take it there. The next most common response in terms of the question around when is it appropriate to initiate sexual intercourse was when there was a consensual desire. So this was not so much about the relationship or thinking about the other person in terms of building a connection, but more about that you both desired it and it was about something you want to do. And the first one was about the male's own individual personal desire. So when he's feeling ready for it. So the one time that they said is appropriate is if you're ready for it. You don't rape or pressure, but you just want it and you figure she'll go for it. And again, this was common, but not the most common time for initiation. In fact, more than that, they said was mutual consensual desire. So the idea that both parties, both the male and female, wanted to have sex and be intimate, but it was non-monogamous and it was sort of hooking up. So there wasn't this sense that it was tying into a relationship. And as one male said, just let her know. Just let her know what you want or how you feel and see if she feels that way too. So it was indicating what your desire was, but also checking with her to see what her desire is as well. So again, this is a little bit different from the first way where these men were saying it should be in a relationship, but it's more that it's okay to have sex and be intimate, but it's not including the use of pressure or rape. The least most common one that emerged, which was interesting, that we brought up as important to consider is the idea of a timeline. So that after you've agreed to something or there's something that's a measurable period. And this was not the most common. In fact, what they found is that we weren't given like a dates or number of weeks. What they said was more about a timeline in terms of how the people connected and then usually how long it would connect. So as this person said, I mean, I guess if we really love each other, then a month or so. So it was connected to the idea that it's not just saying, well, you have to wait 6 weeks and it's okay. It was more that, is there a connection? And then when there's a connection, you have about this much time as an appropriate time frame to start thinking about initiating sexual intercourse with a partner. Next, we started shifting to looking at strategies, or the ways in which you would then sort of initiate the sex, which moved from how long or when it's appropriate. And overwhelmingly, which fits with most of the research on college populations, these males talked about looking for nonverbal communication cues. So this was like body language, or how the person sort of communicated without actually saying anything. And so one of the men said, I would never say it for one. I think it's all about body language, you know. I don't think I'd ever had a conversation as far as being ready to have sex because it'd be uncomfortable for me. So this fits with most of the research on college students, that there usually isn't a discussion. And this is where a lot of issues arise, because without discussion, this is where a lot of miscommunications take place. This also might explain why another approach that was repeated often was sort of the use of flirting or telling jokes around the issue, sort of using indirect verbal communication. So you were talking about sex, but not directly. As this male said, you do not really take the lead, but like maybe bringing up sex, in this case, sex-related topics, and just sort of seeing where it goes. So it's gauging without coming right out and saying. Now, some males did talk about using direct verbal communications, but often this was not before having a sit-down discussion. It was directly saying it in the heat of the moment. And so they said, you feel the energy and you know it's going to happen any moment, but you want to check in, talk about it, make sure there's no miscommunication before you start. So there is direct communication, but it's important to note that the caveat with this was that it was not something that you would sit down in advance and have a discussion without all the energy and the feelings and the emotions that might be tied, which can really sort of shift the meaning of consent or how someone feels at that moment versus later on. The other thing that was really interesting is that a quarter of the men were actually hoping that women would sort of initiate sex. So as this male said, I wanted her to let me know either by physical cues. I think it would be better if the woman just verbalized it. So this really shifts away from the idea that the male should be the initiator, or that he should be in control of the situation. So a quarter of the men did bring up the fact that they would like women to initiate it. So what you're finding here from this result is that the sense of control, or the idea that males should be in charge of everything, it does not follow throughout the ideas of appropriate sexual initiation strategies that are reported by their men here. In fact, there's a lot of sort of give and take, or hopes that there's consent, or striving for consent and respect for the female partner that's emerging. And again, if we just looked at this from a machismo lens, we would not be able to look at that in the same, or give the same sort of critical view, to recognize that values that are linked more to callaberismo characteristics that are emerging from what these men are saying in terms of their beliefs about appropriate sexual initiation strategies that they use, or they hope that their partners would use with them. Now, in the study, we actually were aware of these concepts about cultural messages about appropriate masculinity, and so we looked to see if it would emerge through any of the discussions. And what was interesting was that very few men actually said, well, in my culture, or they even used the term machismo, until we specifically asked about it. So when we did specifically ask about what are some cultural messages, you found that men spoke both about machismo and also values that were associated with caballerismo as well. So you find that there's an understanding between both of these values that emerge. But if you ask these men, if you listen to these men's comments before we explicitly asked about these cultural values around Latino masculinity, none specifically used these terms. When it came to machismo, a lot of them talked about it in terms of what they have heard about or what might be in their culture, but they didn't necessarily view it as something that was applicable to them. So as this man said, well, my culture is pretty machismo, which means hyper-masculine. Men get the message that they decide what happens, particularly in terms of sexual situation. But the caballerismo also emerged, where some men said, so majority of the time, really, my relationships are based off of intimacy, like not physical intimacy, but like getting to know the individual. That's what I was told to do. So you see that there's multiple messages that are being shaped, and not this one-dimensional message, which only gives value or primacy to machismo that these men are discussing here. It's also important to note that some males felt that there weren't culturally specific messages around Latino masculinity. Majority did, but only 36 out of the 47 were able to specifically talk about it. So, in fact, what you found was that these ideas that tie to hypermasculinity, which inform a lot of our research, that they're desiring multiple partners, they constantly have to have sex, or they're controlling, was not really central to a lot of what these men were saying. Instead, what they found was, what we found, I should say, in the study, were that these males were not that different in terms of their values towards their female partners than the research on other white mainstream populations. So this idea that Hispanic males are entrenched in traditional masculinity frameworks really did not hold true here unless they were specifically talking about it. And in those cases, the men specifically gave examples about it and framed it as something that was not applicable to them, but something they heard about. So, for example, one male said, he talked about his country of origin, it's a big deal if the woman doesn't control sex. You see it here, but mainly with guys that are new to the country or older men. People that go to school and learn things will think differently. There are more women than men in school and stuff like that, and they're having sex when they want. He's speaking about women. So things change, beliefs change. Another man said, you hear it from the older generations, but younger people don't think that way. You know, like my dad, and he talks about the home country. He tells my stepsister over there the same thing he tells me here. I mean, he's tougher on her, but he knows that man controlling stuff doesn't work now. And my American white friends say the same type of messages about masculinity. A lot of the beliefs about masculinity, he points out here, are just from a different time, but they're the same everywhere. So there's an understanding that these ideas about machismo really differ depending upon your generation, your country of location, your education, your age. All of those things make a difference. And I think the other thing that's important that the second male here points out is that these same values about hypermasculinity, they see it repeated as something that they're white. And in Miami, you refer to white as American, even though a lot of these males themselves are American. But the ideas about hypermasculinity that we typically associate with machismo are no different than some of the messages that are being taught to white males as well, and they hear it from their friends also. So the idea of framing Latino males as highly machismo is really problematic if you're not also looking and giving the same level of frameworks and characteristics when you're looking at white male masculinity as being hypersexual as well. And so the last area of research I'm going to look at is sexual coercion. And I'm specifically looking at female-initiated sexual coercion. So this is looking at when women pressure men into having sex, either through verbal, emotional, or physical means. And we did a study that looks at sexual coercion and Hispanic males' perceptions of females initiating sexually coercive behaviors against a male. So a lot of people are puzzled when I do this talk because we typically think of women as being victims of sexual coercion, when the reality is that the estimates are 20 to 40% of college males have experienced at least one episode of coercive behaviors. And of course, women are more likely to experience coercion just because of the ways in which we've socialized intimate behaviors. But increasingly, males are also victims. It's not just simply in terms of physical assaults which happen, but more commonly verbal and emotional forms of coercion are occurring. These estimates are probably also very low because, again, the way we're socialized, males are not encouraged or face greater social consequences if they seek out support services or report it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So again, this study looked at college males and their perceptions of female-initiated sexual coercion and the ways in which they looked at it and tying in the lens of Latino masculinity and masculinity more broadly to see how this influences their perceptions. So one of the questions we ask is, could a male be a victim of sexual coercion? Overwhelmingly, most males felt they could. But what's interesting is that even though most felt they could, 2/3 of these males actually hesitated when they responded. So they knew that it was possible a male could be coerced, but if you look at that more in depth, which is one of the reasons like qualitative, you can actually see that Well, there were different types of responses around how men could be coerced. So some men laughed, some men hesitated, some men seemed kind of puzzled by it. So here's an example. Well, I guess that both men and women could be coerced. I can't picture how for men unless it's a group of women or they drug him. But I think it happens more for women, but sometimes for certain types of guys. And another male said, because not only girls, get raped, but he laughed, he chuckled after that. So if we were doing this quantitatively, we'd find that yes, most males feel that males can be victims of coercion. But if we look at the subtle cues and responses, overwhelmingly these men didn't feel that was possible, or that there was caveats to how it can occur. And again, this fits with the wider research about males' vulnerability to sexual coercion. So these responses are not very unique if you're looking at college males. So it's not like Hispanic college males embrace stronger ideas about males not being victims. In fact, this fits with the broader research in terms of males across the board. What I actually found most interesting in this study was when we were asking males about how women could coerce them, it was really interesting how they framed this. So the idea about being violently assaulted by a woman, and that's at the bottom of the chart you see here, it was less common unless she used something. So for example, if a woman used a weapon or used drugs, like slip something in their drink, then men were more likely to perceive themselves as victims. But in terms of physically, like a woman holding him down or using physical fighting, none felt that a woman could do it. So if she did it without having any sort of assistance, then all the men and none of the men in the study felt that this was possible. So for a woman to physically engage in some sort of female-initiated coercion, she had to be assisted in some way, and assisted in a way that the male couldn't overcome it. Again, through the use of a weapon, use of drugs or alcohol. So when you think about it in terms of a physical assault, which males can become victims, unless there was some, and I'm using this word carefully, way in which the woman could overpower him by using additional tools, any male who's assaulted would face a lot of backslash, given that these are the perceptions of ways in which men could be assaulted physically or using violence. Now, if you look at to the top of the chart here, we looked at nonviolent, and this is where we, again, brainstorm, ask the males to talk about it. Overwhelmingly, they were able to come up with ways in which women would do this, and usually it was through behaviors that were within sexualized situations. So, for example, verbal teasing or physical teasing. And if you think back to the earlier study about sexual initiation tactics, these were also cues that were used to initiate sex. So you could see where consent and miscommunication are really important to consider. So a woman could sort of initiate a male or kind of pressure him to doing it by using tactics, which at the same time, in an earlier part analysis of the study, said were appropriate sexual initiation strategies. So verbal teasing or physical teasing. And physical teasing would be like seduction in terms of touching him or stroking him, etc. Or verbal teasing is flirting and giving sexual hints in a way that pressures him. Another one that was discussed was context setup. And examples of this were, oh, she invites you to her room and she makes it seem that you have to do it. Or she invites you over for a movie and she sits close to you. So those were ideas, again, that also tie into things that were earlier framed as appropriate sexual initiation strategies. The other one was through the use of verbal tactics. So the idea of being belittled, like saying you're not man enough, you're not big enough, you can't handle it, or blackmailing, such as, if you don't do it, I'm going to tell everybody we did. Or another example was that if you don't do it, I'm going to tell everybody that you're weak and you're a loser. And so there's this idea of framing it in terms of there'll be consequences for not doing it that could harm them in terms of their masculine identity. There's also this concept of self-deprecating, the woman being self-deprecating and making the male feel guilty by saying, oh, you just don't want to do it with me because I'm not pretty enough, etc. So they feel that they're coerced into doing it. So you could see that there's very different frameworks in terms of how men feel they could be coerced into sexual situations they don't want to be. However, whether it's violent or nonviolent is really sort of separate, and they're very polarized in terms of women's ability to do it, which again ties into beliefs about women's strength and vulnerability as well, and what areas women can target that might make a male feel more vulnerable, have to respond to her in different ways. Now, overwhelmingly, most of the men in the study did not view themselves as victims of sexual coercion when you're looking at it here. And in the cases where there were, it was after discussing what are accused of sexual coercion, were men able to come up with ideas that they were victims. So it's really interesting to think about this when we said, well, what are appropriate responses if you were coerced? So again, thinking about it in terms of nonviolent coercion, if a woman was nonviolent in her coercive tactics versus if she was violent in her tactics. So if we start by looking at the nonviolent coercive tactics that a woman can use, overwhelmingly the males felt that you could just be able to handle it yourself, that there's no need to seek outside services. It's something that a man should be able to deal with and be able to handle it. So one is, again, handling it oneself by just learning, figuring out to respond and figuring out a way to deal with it without having to seek services or having to ask others to help you, etc. The other most common one was just to go ahead and do it. And in fact, one of the males that did respond that he realizes he was coerced said, well, you just go ahead and do it. That's the appropriate thing to do because that's what guys should do. You're supposed to like having sex anyway. So even though you might not want to do it, you just go ahead and go through with it because the consequences for going through with it would be less sometimes than having to face additional tactics or having others find out that you decided not to. The other way is to snub her, which would just be sort of just ignore her and sort of just make it seem like she's not good enough and make her seem like she's the weaker party in this interaction. And then the other one's to laugh it off, to turn it into a joke. So it gives the woman an out, and or belittle her, which is making fun of her and using tactics that play on sexual scripts, such as slut shaming her or calling her names, etc. So that's a little bit different than snubbing her. Snubbing's ignoring and belittling, but without being as harsh or as demeaning to her. So overall, if it's a nonviolent coercive strategy that a woman's using, males felt that this was something that they should be able to deal with on their own. However, if it's violent, this is a case where it is viewed more likely to be appropriate to seek out services. So you can see here that almost 70% of the males in the study felt that if a man experienced sexual coercion that used violent tactics, again using guns, drugs, or a weapon, it would be appropriate to get mental health support or get help from the police or medical personnel. But there was also reporting, when we asked in the brainstorm, they reported a lot of appropriate emotional responses. And so, which we weren't expecting in terms of responses. And what they said in these cases was that the feeling of anger is an appropriate response if a woman uses violent coercive tactics, and also feeling resentful. But most did not say seeking revenge was an important tactic overall. Now, even though most felt that it would be appropriate to seek services if you were a victim, they did acknowledge that there would be difficulty. So, for example, one male here said, you should tell someone, but it may be hard to walk into a police station or tell your friends you were pressured into having sex by a woman who just talked you into it. I wouldn't. Even the girl would look better than you. Maybe get private counseling where it's required to stay between the counselor and the victim, but that's it. And another one said, yeah, how many guys are going to, of course, report it? Even if it did happen, what are you going to say? You'll look like a punk to everyone. So again, this shows you that even though there was an understanding that it would be important to report it, or that there might be a need or for support services, there were a lot of masculinity frameworks that really shifted the ways in which these men were willing to look at it. And so when they did look at who was appropriate to turn to, there was a sense that when you're looking at finding support, it should be male peers or male family members. Those were the ones you could tell were the ones you'd go to first, because they were the ones you could probably trust, and you would just tell the ones who were closest to you. Then you would go to some sort of support service worker like counseling or police, etc. The least likely person that you would reveal your vulnerabilities to would be the female perpetrator. So this again is telling you that there's a lot of ideas about masculinity, appropriate masculinity beliefs that are tied up into these males' perceptions of appropriate responses to sexually coercive behaviors initiated by a woman. But again, this does not differ from the research that's been done on white middle-class college populations. So again, by just saying, well, this is about machismo is problematic, because this is really about masculinity and femininity role expectations that cross all cultural frameworks. Clearly, these are not definitive studies to make sweeping statements about Latino masculinity, but they do show the ways in which it's important to look at things from a broader lens instead of just the one layer. But there are some important things that are unique about this population that might not be applicable to other populations, in terms of understanding the ways in which beliefs about Latino masculinity might really shape decision makings. And the first one is, again, all of these studies focus primarily on males who identified as heterosexual or reported having men who have sex with women, although they might also be men who also have sex with men. So again, it would be interesting to do the study if we looked at specifically men who identify as sexual minorities, for example, gay males or trans males or bisexual males. All of that might find different ways in which understandings about Latino masculinity might shape these types of sexual decision making. The other thing is these are all college males, and this stage of the development might be very different in terms of you're looking at graduate males who are in graduate school who are older and have different sort of life goals, etc. And also maybe even comparing some of these same findings to Hispanic high school students and seeing if stage of development differs around this. This would also shape the ideas about cultural values of intimacy at different stages of the lifespan. So at college males right now, the age of marrying is being pushed up. So students are not necessarily getting married in college or right after college. So the ideas about sexuality and intimacy might be very different during college males, while you might find that Hispanic males who are entering graduate school or older and more interested in being in monogamous long-term relationships might embrace more traditional values, or high school students might be embracing them. So it's important to think about how that frames out. Again, we talked about as well that this data was primarily connected at a Hispanic serving institution that's 70% Hispanic, and in an urban center that's also 80% Hispanic. So it would be very different if you looked at a population of Hispanics that were, for example, living in Idaho. And again, because it was gathered in Miami, it's predominantly a Caribbean and South American Hispanic population. This might be very different if we looked at Mexican American populations in Texas or California, or if you even looked at populations of, for example, Puerto Ricans or Dominicans who live in New York, who have a very different cultural framework in that part of the United States. So that's important to think about as well. But despite these limitations, there are some really key take-home points that we should consider whenever we're doing any sort of work that focus on Latino masculinity as it relates to sexual health. So overall, what we can find is that there is not one framework of Latino masculinity, and it's really shaped by multiple factors. And in these studies, it tended to be focusing around issues of acculturation, education, religiosity, the receiving context, specifically where they lived, what city they were in, and what's the cultural and ethnic racial makeup of that context. And then the other piece is even familial nation of origin. Are there differences if you're Mexican American versus Cuban versus Puerto Rican in terms of where you live and how that shapes values about how people see who you are and what positionality you have within your culture? Also, how recently you came here and how much those values from your nation of origin are still really powerful within your new receiving context are also another area that should be assessed in terms of future research. But overall, the key is that there's great diversity that needs to be considered, that we can't just use sweeping frameworks to say this is Hispanic masculinity. And we need to consider key within group characteristics that sort of inform ideas about sexuality and sexual beliefs and ideas about masculinity as well. So what is the application of this? Well, one of the things that we need to do as researchers is start doing a better job of developing measures. And as I said earlier, Hispanics are the fastest growing population in colleges and universities today. And so this is a really critical thing that needs to be done, that we have to start developing measures that take into account culture, because there are huge within group differences around concepts of male Hispanic identity. And so this is something that we have to do as researchers. Also, on college campuses, we like to celebrate and talk about how college students have real sort of access to education and resources that people in community contexts don't have, which is true. There is a privileging around having doctors and medical personnel and trained and interventions and program designers. However, if we're not really developing curriculum or workshops that adequately address traditionally marginalized or racial ethnic groups' needs and identities within these contexts, this is really problematic and we're not getting at the heart of things. So these are two areas in which the researchers, particularly those working in college campuses, can really seek to improve the ways in which we're doing things and also better address the needs of Hispanic college students. It's particularly as it relates to sexual health and gender identity related issues. So this is just a starting point for this discussion. I hope you take time to review some of the relevant resources and additional readings that are provided. And it's also interesting to hear your feedback on these topics and whether you disagree or have more thoughts on this. And I encourage you to share them with me, because that's the way we're going to be able to move forward and start thinking about these things more broadly and get different ideas and voices into these types of discussions.